There is a force in this universe that feeds on human suffering the same way you and I consume food for survival. Right now, as you watch this video, invisible entities are harvesting emotional energy from billions of people across the planet. They orchestrate breakups, fuel family conflicts, and engineer workplace drama, not because they hate us, but because they farm us. Your heartbreak is their breakfast. Your anxiety is their lunch. Your rage is their dinner. The ancient Gnostics called them Archons, which translates to rulers or authorities. But here is what most people miss about these beings. They do not rule through military force or political systems. They rule through emotional manipulation. They have perfected a technology of consciousness that most humans cannot even perceive, let alone defend against. These entities exist in a frequency just outside normal human perception, operating in what metaphysical researchers call the lower astral plane or fourth dimension. Think about the last major argument you had with someone you loved. Remember how suddenly it escalated, how words came out of your mouth that you did not even recognize as your own, how the person you were arguing with seemed to transform into a stranger, saying things completely out of character. That was not random, that was cultivation. The Archons have mastered the art of amplifying negative emotions, because negative emotional energy is dense, heavy, and incredibly nutritious for beings who exist in lower vibrational states. Modern science is beginning to catch up to what ancient mystics knew thousands of years ago. Neuroscientist Candace Pert discovered that emotions are not just psychological experiences, but actual molecules called neuropeptides that flood through our bodies and radiate into the electromagnetic field surrounding us. When you feel intense anger, fear, or jealousy, your body produces a specific chemical cocktail that radiates outward as an energetic frequency. The Archons have sensory organs specifically evolved to detect and consume these frequencies. But here is where it gets truly disturbing. These entities do not just passively wait for human emotional energy, they actively farm it. They have inserted themselves into the architecture of human relationships, specifically because relationships generate the most intense emotional energy. A betrayal by a stranger means nothing compared to a betrayal by someone you trusted completely. The Archons learned this principle millions of years ago, and they have been refining their farming techniques ever since. Former intelligence officer Robert Monroe, who founded the Monroe Institute for Consciousness Research, stumbled upon this phenomenon during his out-of-body experiences in the 1970s. He described encountering beings in non-physical realms who viewed humans the way we view cattle. He called the energy they harvested loosh, a term he coined to describe emotional energy with high nutritional value for non-physical entities. Monroe was particularly disturbed to discover that these beings had somehow influenced human civilization to maximize loosh production through war, religion, and most importantly, dysfunctional relationship patterns. The Archons do not want you dead. Dead humans produce no emotional energy. They want you alive but suffering. Alive but in constant relationship turmoil. Alive but never quite achieving the inner peace that would make you unpalatable to them. They have engineered human psychology itself to ensure maximum emotional volatility, and relationships are their primary harvesting ground. Look at modern society with fresh eyes. Why do over 50% of marriages end in divorce? Why do family members who once loved each other become bitter enemies over inheritances? Why do best friends suddenly turn on each other over misunderstandings that could easily be resolved? The standard explanation is that humans are just flawed and relationships are difficult. But what if there is an external influence systematically sabotaging human connection? What if the difficulty of relationships is not a bug but a feature, carefully maintained by entities who profit from our emotional pain? The Gnostic texts, particularly the Secret Book of John and the Hypostasis of the Archons, describe these beings as envious of humanity because we possess something they lack, the divine spark of the true Creator. According to these ancient manuscripts, the Archons were created by a false god called the Demiurge, who himself was a flawed copy of the true divine source. The Archons inherited their creator's deficiency. They are essentially parasitic by nature, unable to generate their own life force, forced to steal it from beings who still carry the original divine connection. This is not ancient mythology. This is a precise description of an energetic ecosystem that still operates today. And nowhere is this farming operation more sophisticated than in how the Archons manipulate human relationships. They have turned love itself into a trap, connection into a weapon, and intimacy into a harvesting ground. Understanding their methods is the first step toward breaking free from their influence. The Archons do not fear human love. They have weaponized it. The moment you form a deep emotional bond with another person, you create an energetic cord between your electromagnetic fields. Mystics have observed these cords for centuries during meditation and astral projection. They appear as luminous threads connecting the heart chakras and solar plexus regions of people in close relationships. These cords facilitate emotional exchange, allow empathy to flow between partners, and create the sensation of connection that makes love feel real. But here is what makes this sinister. The Archons have learned to tap into these cords, like vampires tapping veins. Once an emotional connection exists between two people, that connection becomes a highway that these entities can travel along, injecting thoughts, amplifying insecurities, and triggering emotional reactions that generate the dense energy they feed upon. The stronger your attachment to someone, the more access the Archons have to manipulate both of you. Attachment is the key word here. Buddhism recognized this truth thousands of years ago when it identified attachment as the root of suffering. But most people misunderstand what attachment means. It does not mean caring about someone or loving them deeply. Attachment means your emotional stability depends on another person behaving in specific ways. When your happiness requires someone else to act according to your expectations, you have created the perfect conditions for archonic manipulation. Think about jealousy, one of the most destructive forces in relationships. Jealousy feels like it comes from within, like it is your natural reaction to potential loss. But Gnostic texts identify jealousy as one of the primary tools the Archons use to corrupt human consciousness. The Apocryphon of John specifically states that the Archons implanted jealousy into human psychology because it generates massive amounts of loosh while simultaneously destroying the love connections that could help humans transcend archonic influence. Watch how jealousy operates. A person sees their partner talking to someone attractive. Immediately, a thought appears. What if they like that person more than me? What if I am not enough? What if they leave me? These thoughts feel like your own, but they carry a specific signature. They are always catastrophic, always assume the worst, and always generate intense fear. That fear then radiates from your electromagnetic field, like a dinner bell for archonic entities. But it does not stop there. The jealousy makes you act in ways that create the very outcome you feared. You become suspicious, controlling, accusatory. Your partner feels trapped and suffocated. The love that once flowed freely between you becomes contaminated with resentment and distrust. The relationship deteriorates. Both people suffer tremendously, and the Archons feast on the emotional carnage. The Archons have also corrupted the very concept of romantic love in human culture. They have promoted the idea of the one, the soulmate, the perfect person who will complete you. This belief system sets people up for inevitable disappointment, because no human being can fulfill the impossible expectations created by this mythology. When people believe they need another person to feel whole, they enter relationships from a place of deficiency rather than abundance. This deficiency creates energetic holes in the auric field that the Archons exploit ruthlessly. Research by anthropologist Helen Fisher reveals that romantic love activates the same neural pathways as cocaine addiction. The obsessive thinking, the euphoria, the withdrawal symptoms when separated from the beloved These are not poetic metaphors. They are literal, addictive patterns. And like any addiction, romantic love in its culturally conditioned form creates cycles of craving and suffering that generate tremendous emotional energy for non-physical parasites to harvest. The Archons have also engineered specific relationship dynamics that maximize emotional volatility. The pursuer-distance pattern, where one partner desperately seeks connection while the other withdraws, creates a perpetual state of anxiety and rejection that neither person enjoys but both seem unable to escape. The narcissist-empath pairing, where one person constantly takes while the other constantly gives, creates an energy drain that benefits neither human but feeds the archonic presence attached to both. These patterns repeat across cultures and throughout history with such consistency that psychologists treat them as inevitable features of human relationships. But Gnostic wisdom suggests otherwise. These patterns are not natural, they are installed. The Archons have influenced human psychology through multiple mechanisms, including genetic manipulation according to some texts, to ensure that humans form attachments in ways that guarantee suffering. The ancient text, the Exegesis on the Soul, describes how the Archons defiled the human soul by trapping it in material existence and corrupting its ability to love purely. According to this text, the soul originally possessed the ability to unite with others without attachment, to love without possession, to connect without dependency. But the Archons specifically targeted this capacity because unconditional love generates a frequency that is toxic to them. Pure love vibrates at a level that these low-frequency beings cannot tolerate, much less consume. So they corrupted love itself. They turned it into a transaction, a need, an addiction. They made it conditional, possessive, and jealous. They transformed the highest human capacity into the primary mechanism of human suffering. And in doing so, they ensured an endless supply of the emotional energy they require for survival. Understanding this corruption is essential because you cannot free yourself from a trap you do not know exists. The Archons do not start farming you when you become an adult. They begin the installation process in childhood, specifically during moments of trauma when your psyche is most vulnerable to programming. Every human being carries emotional wounds from their developmental years. These wounds become trigger points that the Archons can activate throughout your life to generate emotional reactions on demand. Child psychologist Bessel van der Kolk spent decades studying how trauma gets stored in the body and nervous system. His research revealed that traumatic experiences create permanent alterations in brain structure, particularly in the amygdala and hippocampus. These alterations cause people to react to present situations as if they were still in the traumatic past. A person with abandonment wounds will perceive rejection even when none exists. Someone with betrayal trauma will see deception in innocent behavior. These distorted perceptions create constant relationship conflict that generates emotional energy for chronic consumption. But here is what mainstream psychology misses. While trauma undoubtedly has neurological components, Gnostic wisdom suggests that archonic entities actively participate in traumatic experiences to install specific programs into human consciousness. They do not necessarily cause the initial trauma, though some texts suggest they can influence events through probability manipulation. What they definitely do is amplify the emotional impact of traumatic events and ensure that the wound remains open and easily triggered throughout the person's life. Think about how trauma works. A child experiences neglect from a parent. That experience is painful at the moment, but the archonic influence ensures it becomes a defining wound rather than a difficult memory. The child eventually processes and moves beyond. The Archons attach to the trauma energetically, feeding on the pain in the moment and then maintaining access to that pain by preventing the wound from healing. They accomplish this by installing what Gnostics called archonic thought forms, self-perpetuating patterns of negative thinking that keep the trauma active. These thought forms sound like your own inner voice, which is why they are so effective. They say things like, "Nobody will ever really love me," or "Everyone eventually leaves," or "I cannot trust anyone." These beliefs feel like conclusions you reached based on experience, but they are actually implanted programs designed to ensure you continue generating the emotional frequencies the Archons consume. Every time a relationship triggers these core wounds, you produce a burst of emotional energy, and the archonic entities attached to your field feed. The sophistication of this system becomes apparent when you examine how triggers work in relationships. Your partner does something relatively minor, forgets to call, seems distracted, talks to someone else. This small event activates your core wound. Suddenly, you are not a rational adult dealing with a minor issue. You are a terrified child experiencing abandonment all over again. The emotional response is completely disproportionate to the present situation because you are actually responding to past trauma that the Archons keep deliberately unhealed. Psychotherapist Harville Hendricks discovered that people unconsciously choose romantic partners who resemble the parent who wounded them most. He called this imago matching and built an entire therapeutic model around it. His conscious explanation is that we choose familiar patterns in an unconscious attempt to finally get the love we needed as children. But from a Gnostic perspective, there is another layer. The Archons guide people toward partners who will reliably trigger their core wounds because triggered wounds produce the emotional energy these entities feed upon. This is why relationship patterns repeat with such disturbing consistency. A woman leaves an emotionally unavailable man, swears she will never date that type again, and then finds herself 3 months later with another man who displays the exact same emotional unavailability. A man escapes a controlling relationship, promises himself he will choose differently, and then ends up with another controlling partner. These are not coincidences or simply psychological compulsions. They are guided selections, influenced by archonic entities who know exactly which pairings will generate maximum emotional volatility. The Archons also use what could be called trauma bonding to keep people trapped in harmful relationships. When a relationship cycles between intense conflict and passionate reconciliation, the nervous system becomes addicted to this pattern. The relief after conflict resolution produces dopamine and oxytocin that feel like love but are actually neurochemical responses to the end of stress. People mistake this chemical cycle for deep connection and stay in relationships that are systematically destroying them because the Archons have hijacked their reward systems. Neuroscientist Jacques Panksepp identified separation distress as one of the most powerful emotional systems in mammalian brains. When social bonds are threatened, the brain produces responses similar to physical pain. The Archons exploit this biological reality by ensuring relationships remain unstable enough to constantly activate separation distress without fully ending, keeping people in a state of chronic, low-grade panic that produces steady emotional energy output. The truly diabolical aspect of the trauma implantation system is that it is self-reinforcing. Your wounds cause you to behave in ways that create the experiences that seem to validate those wounds. If you believe people always leave, you will unconsciously push people away, and when they leave, your wound is confirmed and strengthened. The Archons have created a closed-loop system where your own psychology works against you, generating suffering that feeds them while keeping you trapped in patterns you consciously want to escape, but unconsciously perpetuate. Breaking free requires recognizing that your deepest wounds may not be entirely your own. Human beings are capable of a form of love that terrifies the Archons because it starves them. This love does not depend on another person behaving correctly. It does not fluctuate based on circumstances. It does not turn to hate when disappointed. The ancient Greeks called it agape, unconditional love. Buddhism calls it metta, or loving kindness. Christians call it charity, or divine love. Whatever the name, this frequency of love vibrates at a level that not only fails to nourish archonic entities, but actually damages them. This is why the Archons have invested tremendous energy into ensuring humans remain trapped in lower frequency relationship dynamics. They do not fear human hatred. Hatred is just an inverted attachment, and it produces dense emotional energy they can easily consume. What they fear is humans discovering their capacity for unconditional love, because that discovery would end the farming operation entirely. Physicist William Tiller spent decades researching how human intention and emotion affect physical reality at the quantum level. His experiments demonstrated that coherent emotional states, particularly states of genuine love and appreciation, measurably alter the structure of matter and the behavior of energy fields. When a human maintains a stable state of unconditional love, their electromagnetic field becomes coherent rather than chaotic, radiating at frequencies that are literally inhospitable to low vibrational entities. The Gnostic text, the Gospel of Philip, contains a mysterious passage that states, "Love covers a multitude of sins." Most interpret this morally, but Gnostic scholars suggest it is describing an energetic reality. When a human abides in genuine love, their energy field becomes impenetrable to archonic influence. The phrase "covers" is more accurately translated as "shields" or "protects." Unconditional love is not a nice sentiment. It is spiritual armor. This is precisely why the Archons work so diligently to prevent humans from accessing this state, particularly in romantic relationships where it would be most natural to develop. They accomplish this through several mechanisms. First, they promote the belief that unconditional love means tolerating abuse or staying in harmful situations. This distortion causes people to reject the concept entirely because they correctly recognize that boundaries and self-preservation are necessary. But unconditional love does not mean accepting mistreatment. It means maintaining a loving state internally while making whatever external choices are necessary for well-being. Second, the Archons have corrupted the path to unconditional love by promoting spiritual bypassing, the use of spiritual concepts to avoid dealing with real psychological issues and emotions. When people use love and light philosophy to suppress anger, deny trauma, or avoid confronting dysfunction, they are not accessing higher frequency love. They are creating spiritual bypasses that leave them vulnerable to manipulation while believing they are evolved. True unconditional love includes acknowledging shadow material, processing difficult emotions, and maintaining boundaries. It is not spiritual bypassing that's spiritual maturity. Third, the Archons attack anyone who begins genuinely developing unconditional love capacity. Mystics throughout history have reported that their spiritual progress was met with increased external challenges, relationship conflicts, and internal temptations. The Desert Fathers of early Christianity described this as spiritual warfare, the intensification of demonic attack proportional to spiritual advancement. Gnostic texts confirm this principle. As a person raises their frequency toward unconditional love, archonic entities make desperate attempts to pull them back down through any means available. These attacks often come through relationships, because that is where humans are most vulnerable. A person begins meditation practice, starts to experience inner peace, and suddenly their partner picks a massive fight. Someone makes progress in therapy, begins healing core wounds, and then encounters a situation that triggers them worse than ever before. An individual experiences a spiritual breakthrough, feels connected to divine love, and then faces betrayal from someone they trusted completely. These are not random coincidences. They are targeted attacks designed to generate emotional reactions that will lower the person's frequency back to levels the Archons can influence and feed from. Researcher Rudolf Steiner, founder of anthroposophy, described how archonic entities called archomanic forces specifically target human emotional development to prevent the evolution of consciousness. He warned that these beings were preparing to incarnate physically in the coming centuries, and that humanity's only defense was developing the capacity for brotherly love, his term for unconditional love between humans. Steiner was ridiculed by mainstream science, but his warnings align perfectly with ancient Gnostic teachings. The ultimate threat to archonic control is not individual humans achieving unconditional love, though that is problematic for them. The existential threat is humans forming relationships based on unconditional love, because such relationships create geometric increases in coherent energy fields. Two people in genuine unconditional love do not produce twice the field strength of one person. They produce exponential increases. Groups of people relating from unconditional love create field effects that the Archons cannot penetrate at all. This is why all spiritual traditions emphasize community and fellowship. It is not just about social support, it is about creating energetic fields strong enough to resist parasitic attachment. The early Christians practicing agape love in their communities were not just being nice, they were generating field effects that protected them from archonic influence. When the Roman Empire corrupted Christianity and replaced unconditional love with religious hierarchy and fear-based control, it was an archonic infiltration that successfully dismantled humanity's most powerful defense system. The path to defeating archonic manipulation in relationships does not start with fixing your relationships. It starts with developing unconditional love within yourself first, directed initially toward yourself. Self-love in its truest form, not narcissism but genuine compassion for your own being, creates the foundation from which you can relate to others without the attachment and need that the Archons exploit. When you need nothing from another person to feel whole, when you can love them without requiring them to behave in specific ways, you have become energetically invisible to the Archons. They cannot feed on a transaction that is not occurring. They cannot manipulate emotions that are not attached to outcomes. Understanding archonic manipulation is only the beginning. Breaking free requires specific practices that sever the energetic connections these entities depend on and develop the sovereignty that makes you unharvestable. This is not quick or easy. The Archons have had thousands of years to perfect their control systems. But humans possess something the Archons lack, the divine spark that gives us access to creative power they cannot imagine. When properly activated, this spark dissolves archonic influence like sunlight dissolves shadow. The first and most critical practice is ruthless self-observation without judgment. The Archons depend on you remaining unconscious of their influence. When you begin watching your thoughts and emotions with detached awareness, you start noticing patterns that do not feel authentically yours. That sudden spike of jealousy that seems to come from nowhere. That thought of self-hatred that appears fully formed. That urge to start a fight over nothing. These are often archonic intrusions, and conscious awareness is the first line of defense. Gurdjieff, the Armenian mystic who taught extensively about hostile forces controlling human behavior, emphasized that humans spend most of their lives in a state of waking sleep, mechanically reacting to stimuli without conscious choice. He taught a practice called self-remembering, maintaining simultaneous awareness of your inner experience and external environment. This divided attention creates a state of presence that archonic thought forms cannot penetrate because they require your unconscious identification to function. The second practice is energetic cord cutting. Every relationship creates etheric cords, but not all cords serve your highest good. Some are channels for genuine love and connection. Others are feeding tubes for archonic parasites. You can learn to perceive these cords through meditation and visualization, and you can sever the ones that drain you. This does not mean ending the relationship necessarily, but it does mean withdrawing the energetic permission for another person or an entity attached to them to access your field without your conscious consent. A simple technique involves visualizing the cords connecting you to another person, determining which ones feel healthy and which ones feel parasitic, and using visualized light or cutting tools to sever the unhealthy connections while blessing the person and releasing them to their highest good. This practice often brings immediate relief, a lightness and clarity that confirms something real has shifted. Some people report that relationships spontaneously improve after cord cutting because the archonic presence that was corrupting the connection has been severed. The third practice is transmutation rather than suppression of negative emotions. The Archons feed on emotional energy, but they can only consume it in its raw, unconscious form. When you bring full awareness to an emotion, feel it completely without acting on it destructively, and allow it to move through your system, you transform that energy into something the Archons cannot use. This is what ancient alchemists meant by turning lead into gold. The lead of unconscious reactive emotion becomes the gold of conscious presence. Psychiatrist Carl Jung discovered this principle independently through his exploration of shadow work. He found that patients who learned to integrate their shadow material, the rejected and repressed aspects of themselves, became substantially more whole and less vulnerable to possession by what he called autonomous complexes, psychological patterns that seem to operate independently of conscious will. From a Gnostic perspective, these autonomous complexes are often archonic attachments that gain power through the energy of repressed emotion. Integration starves them. The fourth practice is cultivating sovereignty through connection to source directly, without intermediaries. The Archons maintain control partly through religious systems that teach humans they need priests, churches, or institutions to access the divine. This is false. The divine spark within you is your direct connection to source consciousness, and you can strengthen this connection through meditation, prayer, time in nature, or whatever practice genuinely opens your heart and mind to something greater than your individual ego. When you establish a strong, direct connection to source, you create an energetic pipeline that feeds you with high-frequency energy. You stop being dependent on external validation, approval, or emotional energy from others because you are receiving nourishment from an unlimited supply. This is what Jesus meant when he spoke of living water that quenches thirst permanently. This is what Buddha discovered under the Bodhi tree, that liberation comes from within, not from any external condition. The fifth and final practice is forming conscious relationships based on mutual sovereignty rather than mutual dependency. This means choosing partners who are doing their own inner work, who take responsibility for their own emotions, who do not require you to behave in specific ways for them to feel secure. It means being that kind of partner yourself. These conscious relationships still experience challenges, but they do not become food for the Archons because both people refuse to remain unconscious during conflict. In a conscious relationship, when a trigger appears, both people recognize it as an opportunity for healing rather than evidence of betrayal. When conflict arises, both people look first at their own contribution rather than blaming the other. When difficult emotions surface, both people feel them fully without projecting them onto their partner. This level of relationship is rare because it requires substantial inner development from both people, but it is the only form of relationship that the Archons cannot successfully farm. The ultimate liberation comes when you realize that you are not your thoughts, your emotions, your relationships, or your life circumstances. You are the consciousness that observes all of these, and that consciousness is inviolable. The Archons can manipulate your thoughts, trigger your emotions, and orchestrate external events. But they cannot touch the essential you, the observer, the divine spark that has existed before this life and will exist after it. When you rest in that awareness consistently, you become functionally invisible to archonic influence. This does not mean you will never feel pain or never experience relationship challenges. It means you will no longer be unconscious food for parasitic entities. You will no longer generate suffering that serves a hostile intelligence. You will reclaim your emotional energy for your own evolution. And in doing so, you will starve the Archons, not through fighting them, but through withdrawing the consent they require to feed on you. This is the path to sovereign love, the love that liberates rather than enslaves, the love the Archons fear most because it ends their harvest forever.